Hello and welcome to History and Practice. This is Dr. Kate Antonova. I am a professor of history at the City University of New York. It's a little dark here today. It's just rainy. I'm not doing this late at night. Anyway, this is kind of part two of a video that I did before. I was talking in the previous video about kind of my view of the historical impact, if any, and I think largely not. We'll see, right, of the Depp Heard trial that's gotten so much media attention and that I followed pretty closely. Previous video is about the trial itself and my experience of that trial itself and what I think the trial actually does. In this part two, I want to talk about the social media trial, which is a whole different thing, very different thing. And I think that actually, I don't think it specifically on this issue is going to have any kind of long-term impact. I think it's going to be forgotten when the next thing comes up, but I do think it's representative of something that's larger and very, very historically significant, possibly apocalyptically so. We'll see. I hope not, obviously, but I want to kind of talk about it in that context. And again, I'm taking a really, really meta view from back in the stands, right, as a historian, for what that's worth. And I know that feels odd, right? It may feel odd that I'm not like talking about, I don't know, Civil War or something long past. Historians do study current things. That's not actually my research area. But what the point of this whole channel is to explore history practice rather than specific historical content. And so I want to employ historical thinking on things that are going on that people are very familiar with while it's happening. That's part of what this is, and it's all going on a playlist for that kind of thing, as opposed to I have other playlists for sort of explaining the basics of what historical thinking is and how it works, and other stuff too. That's building, by the way, nail polish, thanks to my almost 7-year-old. Anyway, so talking about the social media aspects of this Depp Heard event. I mean, the first thing that certainly Amber Heard has talked about a lot and her attorneys have talked about a lot is her sort of character assassination, especially on TikTok, but really all over the internet. And absolutely, it's happening, it's true, and a lot of it is grossly misogynistic, grossly misogynistic. The internet gets out of hand. Once it gets something in its teeth, it kind of gets out of hand with anything. It's kind of natural in human nature. And in this case, I very much understand where it comes from. To me, it is all of a piece with, for example, Dr. Spiegel, who testified at the trial, who was something. I mean, his testimony was, in my view, unethical, not just because it broke the Goldwater rule. It was ridiculous and unreliable. And to do that as a professional, I think I just feel sorry for everybody else in the same profession, because I think that's really uncool. But then people apparently, I just heard about this on the internet like everybody else, went real world and wrote terrible reviews, and apparently I'm sure he got hate mail and stuff. It happens all the time. I'm sure I will get hate mail and whatever just from posting this video, right? It's how the internet works. It is so wrong and so unhealthy. And that's kind of exactly in a nutshell what I want to talk about with this whole part of this video, is the unhealthiness of that and the impulses of that and what it does to us as a society, and how people doing it feel they are trying to achieve justice. They're trying to get off just passively consuming social media and doing something about something they see as a real problem. And I think a lot of the memes, including the most misogynistic memes about Amber Heard, are people who are truly appalled by what she's done. I share that feeling of being totally appalled by what she's done. As I explained in the earlier video, I explained why and how I came to that view. It is based entirely on the evidence of the trial, and most especially the tapes themselves of Amber Heard herself in the moment, which is frankly so much better evidence than we ever normally get on any controversy. It's amazing. As a historian, I would kill to have tapes of conversations of anything. And yes, I listened to them all. And anyway, so as far as I'm concerned, I think she's a deeply disturbed, very young woman who got herself in way too deep and has tried to take a way out and then dig in her heels on that way out that is sick and wrong and does enormous harm, just unfathomable harm when you think about the ripple effects throughout society, let alone to the individual people she's harmed, and she's harmed a lot of people. I really, really hope she gets the help that she needs. That said, it is totally not okay to then go after her on social media and make her sort of the piñata of the moment. I think what I would have liked to see a healthy society do, not that I remotely expect this, we know what society we live in, right? But what would be a healthy reaction is to feel some empathy for her, absolutely hold on to the consequences. She is someone who's not faced a lot of consequences in her very young life so far. She should face consequences. Some of those consequences may be coming. I don't believe she's going to have to pay the settlement. She can't, and she probably won't. But there's perjury investigations and so on, and just the global humiliation. What happened is the first time she's had even close to that kind of consequences. I hope that leads somewhere. She's very young, has a long way to go on her path through life, and I hope goes somewhere eventually, somewhere good. I think the totally healthy thing to do, and it's really hard, would be to say, yes, she needs consequences. It's best for her, best for society. But also, same with Dr. Spiegel, yes, what he did on the stand was completely unacceptable. But that doesn't mean a harassment campaign is justified. Harassment is never justified, no matter how horrible the person is. No harassment is justified. What you can do if someone's doing horrible things and not being held accountable is work on the system that's not holding them accountable. Work on the media that's not holding them accountable. That is something that we can actually do, and we can give our own voice to it, right? And explain why we think someone should be held accountable in reasonable terms. And I don't want to ask for civility. I don't think civility, I hate tone policing. I don't think we need to do that. But what we do need to do is stick to the topic, to not let our feelings sort of turn into basically a revenge fantasy, which is what a lot of this kind of memeing is. And I think it was very easy for a lot of people who did not watch the trial, who were consuming mainstream legacy media and this kind of Twitter threads about the trial, and think that they know what happened because they read a lot of really detailed articles. Oh boy, as someone who watched the trial, every single one of those articles, every single one of those legacy media takes was significantly inaccurate on fundamentals. Really, I was so shocked. And I'm someone who's quite cynical about media going into this. I and everyone else watching the trial have been floored by how distinctly false every single account of the trial has been. It's shocking. And maybe that's the thing that's going to come out of this. If, I don't know, the chances of the legacy media being held accountable for any of this or it ever coming out doesn't look good right now. And I think that's the only way for there to actually be change coming out of that would be significant. Unfortunately, what it does is just add to the general disillusionment. And on the whole, I think that's not a great thing, even though this is very well-founded disillusionment. It's not just all the media lies, if it doesn't say what I agree with, then it's lying. That's all stupid. But when the legacy media really is doing badly and there is no consequence for them, what happens is that we all become more disillusioned, we all become less trusting, and everything just continues to sort of dissolve as a civilization, which seems to be the moment we're in, right? I hope it's a moment that ends at some point, but it might not be. I don't know. So yes, the people who are sort of relying on legacy media, who believe they're, and are, I'm sure, I trust, critical consumers of media, who stick to legacy media, who don't go into the even crazier stuff, and who are reading whole articles, not just headlines. I understand the feeling that you are doing your due diligence there. I've often relied on that myself, and I may have made horrible mistakes. And part of what I'm taking out of this trial is really thinking about that, because I do that a lot. Mostly that's as far as we can go, right? It's rare for it to be something like this, where the entire trial and actually all the evidence from the trial became completely public domain. So we can actually compare the two. That almost never happens. The fact that that happens now is eye-opening. And I really urge anyone who's getting invested in this, obviously no one needs to be invested in this, but if you are invested in this and you have not watched any of the primary sources or read any of the primary sources, and you're relying on these secondaries, even if you chose all of the most reasonable ones, the most reliable ones historically, and that you read them critically and you read them thoroughly, even if you did all of that, you need the primary sources. That's a principle number one of academic research. You don't obviously have to do academic research on this. I'm just saying, maybe withhold an opinion until you have, because this is an opportunity where you can, and everyone, literally everyone who has seen the whole trial is looking at the mainstream media takes and going, holy shit, what? Are they always like this? Because this is insane. It is completely insane. And I'm not saying that those who watch the trial are in the tank for Johnny Depp, the mainstream media is in the tank for Amber Heard. I am not, those are sides. Don't sides things. These are not sports teams. It's not sports teams. This is reality. Reality is complicated. The reality of the trial was a lot of things. There was lots of evidence presented. There were lots of witnesses presented. One of the things that came through in the trial is that Amber Heard's representation was just not nearly as good as Johnny Depp's representation. And it is possible to look at that and say, maybe that's why she lost. I think the evidence itself, even if it were possible to delete the lawyers from the scenario and just sort of have the piles of evidence as they came in, and you can actually do that actually by going to the courthouse website. All the evidence is right there. Some of it, not all of it, is public on the courthouse website, but you can get it elsewhere on the internet in its entirety without commentary. It's entirely possible. You can look at just that without the lawyering. And that's also very, very clear, unfortunately, that Amber Heard lied. There's a lot of kind of speculation that the reason her team were very experienced, high-powered, obviously she hired top people. The reason they came across as badly as they did is that it was kind of client-led, and that's, I find, plausible. But in any case, the trial, I'm not saying it's like people watching the trial are all Johnny Depp fans, people following on the mainstream media are all Amber Heard fans. That's kind of how it kind of looks. And then that starts to get reported on that way. It's just so many layers of nonsense, layers and layers and layers of bad assumptions and nonsense and leaping to conclusions. I'm going to try to untangle that. That's kind of what I'm trying to do with this video, is take a step back, poke a lot of holes in all of this, and hopefully just kind of open it up for some deeper thinking. I will mention there is a channel on YouTube. It's Hogue Law, a lawyer named something Hogue, I forget his first name, who's gone through, he's got a, what is it called? Hangouts and Headlines, Headlines and Hangouts, something like that, where he goes over the headlines as someone who live streamed the trial throughout. I don't love everything Hogue has done. I'm not like a super fan or fan at all. I'm not even a subscriber, but I have checked out his headlines takes because I also watch the trial, so I can see it from that point of view for myself, and go through kind of the headlines. And he does go through it in a kind of lawyerly way that I find helpful. So that might be something you might be interested in. Going back to the memes, some of the, even, the professional lawyers who were commentating on the trial as it happened were doing things like bringing in some memes for like some, comic relief in moments. And some of those memes were nasty. And I frankly found that unprofessional. I got turned off. That's part of how I ended up with Emily D. Baker, is the one lawyer stream I absolutely highly recommend. I ended up by the end watching quite a bit of it, and no red flags of any kind, as far as I was concerned. No fuckery is her slogan, and that was exactly what I think I found there. Some of the other ones, not so much, and definitely some of the legal commenters were coming at this from a very misogynistic point of view and said some things that I found revolting. So here's the thing about that. There's, of course, a range of views. And of course, among the commenters, we got everything across the, political spectrum and across the sort of personal prejudices spectrum, which is not necessarily always the same as the political spectrum, right? Of course, you get all of his views. And the great thing is that we can go shop around and find the one that we're comfortable with. And for me, that was Emily D. Baker. The thing is, on social media, and this is just as messed up as the people kind of going real world and turning to harassment in this like crazed revenge fantasy rather than doing something actually productive, with what is a perceived injustice. And in some cases, I think the injustice is real. In some cases, I would disagree, whatever, but whatever your view is, do something productive with it, not something that's harassment, particularly harassment of innocent people, because it often bleeds into that. But even when the person's maybe not so innocent, there are channels for real consequences, and harassment is not a real consequence. Nobody learns from harassment. People just get defensive, as they should, because it's unfair to be harassed. So don't do that. But on the other hand, also don't take the worst that's out there, cherry pick it, and say, that's that side. That's the emblem of that side. Therefore, that's that whole side. Therefore, I can dismiss that side. Therefore, I can retrench in the view I started in. And unfortunately, this is another thing that's even more common than the going real world and harassment. It's almost universal, in fact, on social media. What people are doing is, and I see this, it's not just this trial, it's everything, literally every issue that hits Twitter, every single issue. Almost everyone watching, and I try to follow the exceptions, and I mean, you can go, I'm at KPANYC at Twitter. on Twitter, and you can see who I follow, and I try to curate my feed quite a lot, and I follow a lot of really good people. I still get disappointed a lot. I also block the hell out of anybody who, as I like to put it, isn't ready for the grown-ups table, who's just not engaging in discourse in a way that makes it discourse. They're doing it in a way that devolves it into something far less than that. So anyway, you can go look, and I follow some exceptions. I think some really good people are on Twitter, but most of it, almost every time, and this will include even a lot of the people I admire most, and myself, I've absolutely fallen into this. I'm not trying to say I'm like, holier than thou. We all fall into it. News thing, a controversy, whatever, an event hits our feeds. And particularly when you see disturbing reactions that are really catch you, hit your buttons. Like for me, it's misogyny, absolutely hits my buttons. Once I see that, what can happen is I'm saying, oh my God, that's the reaction. That's how these people are taking this. That's who these people are. I now hate these people. That reconfirms all of my priors. It tells me absolutely nothing about the event of the day. And what does it contribute to me, to the discourse? Absolutely nothing. It's just this kind of ritual we do. And a lot of times it's not doing a lot of harm either, although I think my mental health has really suffered, and that's why I'm really disengaging from Twitter. But it does nothing at best. And it can really be bad when what we do is we've defined this other as really bad. And it is othering, if you want to take the academic term for it. This is something the academic left on Twitter actually does a ton. We do othering all the time, even though we write about how horrible othering is. We do it all the time too. Everybody does it. And for me, to be honest, any sort of avatar or an emoji in the name or whatever that tells me someone's coming from a place that I've associated with white nationalism, I actually feel perfectly fine. I have pure conscience and a good night's sleep on the idea of just blocking on site. Because to me, white nationalism is not an opinion of value. It is a hatred. It is simply an act of hatred. It is an act of destruction. It is a gun going off in the social discourse. And that needs to be stopped on site. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about when someone, there's reactions to things that are very emotionally fueled. They hit your buttons, which are often very personal buttons, or they may be sort of your pet peeve buttons that are largely intellectual, but it's kind of a thing for you. That happens to me a lot. I have a lot of intellectual pet peeves. And then you're instantly their side versus our side. It's an act of othering right away. And I am not saying the solution should be we need to understand everybody. There are things I very firmly disagree with. I believe my opinions on that are very firmly based. Comes from a lot of experience and a lot of study, and I'm not going to change my mind. Certainly not from somebody's emotional plea on social media. But what I feel like I need to do, and I'm increasingly learning, is I need to let this go by. I know there are people who feel that out there. It's not my business. There's nothing I can do about those feelings. They're not going to listen to me, and I don't want to listen to them. Why am I trying, right? Why am I engaging with this even so much as reading it? It just harms me. And frankly, before social media, I would just not have had to listen to this, except, at the occasional family gathering, which I no longer go to. It's not a thing I would have had to listen to. And I frankly put a lot of effort in my life into moving away from frankly racist communities that I grew up in and that I don't want to be a part of. And then what I try to do, rather than harass people who I believe are really, really wrong. And I shouldn't keep going to racism. It's just, it's so unequivocal. It should be something, maybe, I don't know, should we get into abortion? That'll be fun. But people who totally disagree with me on something, what I try to do is act politically to the extent I'm able. I try to speak what I believe without it being a battle against someone else. I try to speak what I believe with the receipts of, where I'm coming from. How do I know this? Why it's worth listening to me? And I'm going to talk a lot more about that because that's really the key to meaningful communication, or at least an attempt at meaningful communication. I give money where I can. I do what I can, right? Engaging with a rando on the internet is not doing what I can, which is not to say that you should totally ignore the trolls, right? This kind of old internet advice of ignore the trolls. When I'm in a conversation and a troll appears, I do feel I need to say something for everybody else watching, because when the trolls are just allowed to kind of proliferate, that hurts everybody involved. And so I think for the sake of everyone else, I'm going to say, this is trolling, and then block, delete, whatever. I think we all need to do our part to keep the social environment clean, right? Like, it's a good idea when you see garbage on the street and there's a trash can right there, pick it up and put it in the trash. When you're, put away your shopping carts in the grocery store parking lot, right? I do all of those things. I consider it being a good citizen. I'm also slightly OCD, so it kind of bugs me. But doing those things on social media, the equivalent to me on social media of a kind of, good social hygiene is to, when you see people are trolls or bots, obvious bots, be like, that's a troll, that's a bot. Let's all, that's not part of the conversation. Let's just all agree on that. But when it's a real person who's just really feeling the feelings and wants to just do something with it, I can feel that. I'm having my own feelings. I've been on the internet since 1993. I've engaged in a lot of that. Trying not to do it anymore. It's so unhealthy for me, whatever effect it has on anyone else. And I think that's precisely zero. It has really bad effects on me. What it does is make those feelings worse. And it entrenches me against humanity in general. It makes me really antisocial. That's not good when it's happening on a global level to everyone, right? Like, wow, so not good. So anyway, I've gone kind of way general. I want to go back to what I'm seeing. There's a sort of everybody who watched all the trial and saw all of the evidence. And I'm sorry to say, I simply don't believe you've done all that and still come to the conclusion that Amber Heard isn't lying, because the evidence is so unequivocal. Unless, of course, you're also having really deep personal experience where you maybe before you saw the trial, as you got into this, what you saw first is the tremendous misogyny of the stuff around the trial. And I not only don't want to deny that exists, I'm pointing to how much that exists. If you come through the walls of misogyny, you're going to come in a certain defensive stance, and you're going to come in having convinced yourself this is what is happening before you see what's actually happening in the trial. The misogynist wall is happening outside the trial, and it is real and it is awful, but it's not actually the trial. It's not actually the issues, and it's not actually the two parties involved in the case. It really is just about two people, two, frankly, very messed up people. Both of them very messed up. I think one is lying and one was a victim, but I think they're both really messed up. I wouldn't really want to directly interact with either of them, let alone be married to either of them. They're really messed up, and I hope they both move on and get to a much better place. But it's just those two people. The problem when you approach that case coming through the wall of social media misogyny and legacy media misogyny, but also legacy media misinformation, which unfortunately was shockingly extensive in this case, you're coming in with a whole lot of baggage. And that baggage is not fake baggage. It's based on something real, but you're bringing it into another circumstance and you're not separating the two. And it's almost impossible to do so. I don't know how you would. I don't know how I would have reacted to this if I had seen all the social media takes before I got to the trial, if by coincidence of my feed and my time and attention to that feed, which was very possible, that I'd first read all the stuff on Twitter and all the takes on Twitter and the articles about it, I would never have gotten to the trial. I wouldn't have bothered, and I would have walked away saying, what a horrible misogyny party. And this is awful, and yet another victim of domestic violence, which is what a lot of feminists I follow have concluded. And as someone who went the other way and saw the trial first, to say, unfortunately, that's wrong. It doesn't change anything you and I believe about feminism, about how domestic violence victims get treated, about how women get treated. It doesn't change a damn thing. These are just two people. These are just two people. And if we're honest with ourselves, we all knew going in, we all know now, that it is possible for a man to be abused by a woman. It is possible for a woman to raise a false allegation. We also know, and still know now, that both things are very rare. Far, 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 far less common than the usual scenario of women being abused and disbelieved. We all know that. This trial changed nothing, changed none of that. It's a trial about two people. It was a really interesting trial and maybe has implications. And watching that trial, I actually do, I have to say, there is no other way for a rational person to do other than what the jury did. And the jury did, as I said last time in the other video, a really, really good job of very, very specifically addressing each legal claim on its merits with the evidence only from the trial. And they came to I believe, the only conclusion any rational person could come to. So I think it was a shockingly good trial, actually, and I really don't expect that from any legal system, but it was good. It was a well done trial, despite a lot of craziness that went on. It was frankly part of why a lot of us watch the trials. Entertaining. If you've missed it, go check out the vaping guy. Wow, and Isaac Baruch, and there was just a lot of. It was entertaining in ways that actually have nothing to do with the outcome or either party. It was just, you get a couple of Hollywood people. There's some really interesting witnesses. That's all I can say. Anyway, so the problem is when you go at it through the misogyny is what happens. And I've seen a lot of this on social media too. And I have so much empathy for it. Is I'm not a victim of domestic abuse. Thank God. I'm very lucky and privileged not to be. Statistically, I lucked out. I've seen women, domestic violence victims on social media who are, outspoken for Amber Heard. What they're doing is they're saying a meme that's about Amber Heard, the people making the meme, the people passing on the meme, the people laughing at the meme, find it funny, not because they're inhuman or evil, or even, I think in this case, in this one case, most of them, I think, are not more misogynistic than everyone in this culture is at a baseline level. They're laughing because Amber Heard, when you saw the trial and saw her on the stand and listened to those tapes, she is cruel. She lies with almost every word out of her mouth. She's laughably fake on the stand. I mean, it was extremely awkward to watch. I found it painful to watch because it was, the joke is that it's bad acting. And yes, it is that. I don't find it funny at all. I find it disturbing and sad. But I understand, and particularly I've got to remind you, a whole lot of the people laughing at these memes and sort of relishing in a way the character assassination of Amber Heard are victims of domestic abuse also. Some men, but the vast majority of women, because that's the vast majority of victims, are reveling in this, what I fairly call misogynistic character assassination, because they're feeling vindicated by it as survivors of domestic abuse. Yet other survivors of domestic abuse, not seeing the trial first, going in believing Amber Heard, as I did originally, right? If you go in believing Amber Heard, you see just the misogyny all over social media, you identify with Amber Heard, and it feels like they're assassinating you. Oh, I so feel that. I so feel that. That is very real and very painful. She's not you. She's faking and you're not. She is not you. And this just massive scale nastiness towards Amber Heard, I have to tell you, it is really not directed at women abuse victims. It is directed at an abuser. That is how 90% of the public and everyone who watched the trial sees Amber Heard. So when you're looking at these awful misogynistic memes, and when I say misogynistic, I mean they take misogynistic forms, they play on misogynistic tropes. From an academic point of view, it is clearly misogynistic. I'm very comfortable saying that. But I'm also very comfortable saying a lot of the people creating, passing on, and laughing at the memes are not doing that from a misogynistic place, because they're coming at it from this human being is a really nasty abuser who has caused tremendous harm, not just victimizing one person or actually maybe all of her partners. And there's some evidence for that. But the public, gaslighting the public, and fundamentally any false accusation, they are rare, but the damage is really outsized to their numbers, insanely outsized to their numbers. And that's deeply disturbing. So I'm feeling the people who are reveling in the memes and who really want Amber Heard to face consequences, because I feel that anger they have. And that is also coming from a place of victims of abuse, loved ones of victims of abuse, wanting justice to happen. The same people who haven't experienced the trial or saw it only later through a different lens and can't see what I think the vast majority of us, including the jury, saw, are seeing all the misogyny first. And in the same way, victims of abuse and loved ones of people with abuse and people who are just empathetic and truly understand abuse, look at that and identify with Amber. She's actually the abuser though. So we all need to take a really big step back, because what's happening is a whole lot of people who all have everything in common, who want abuse victims to be believed and to get justice, who want abusers to face consequences, not harassment and revenge fantasies, but consequences, legal consequences, social consequences also. Everyone's actually on the same page, but instead we're screaming at each other, blocking people forever, entrenching ourselves in a belief that a huge part of the population is horrible, when yes, part of the population is absolutely horrible, but not quite that huge a part. It's sick and it's killing us all, and we're all participating in it. And that's why I'm backing off Twitter. Watching this, just everything about it makes me incredibly sad. It makes me mourn for humanity. And I do think, and this is a historical point I want to make, that looking at this as a historian, my area of study is really around the beginning stages of the Industrial Revolution and those transformations. And what I'm looking at now is an information revolution, and I find that really fascinating. And I am, sort of have this project in the back of my mind about the information revolution. The role of social media is revolutionary in the sense of a massive transformation of everything. Not revolutionary in the sense of leading towards anything necessarily other than total destruction, because at this point, I think it's brought nothing but destruction. I really hope we can turn that around, but we're not going to turn it around without making some different decisions. We really need to make different decisions. Another thing I wanted to bring up in terms of historical evidence and how I look at evidence versus kind of the evidence on the internet is another kind of piece I wanted to bring into this before I wrap it up, is that what I've seen a lot of on social media that is on the supporting Amber Heard side are these long threads of receipts about how misogynistic Johnny Depp is. I want to start by saying I'm not remotely disbelieving the idea that Johnny Depp has been a lifelong misogynist. For one thing, I noticed throughout the trial, he's always referring to his, whoever his romantic partner is my girl, which is just, I hate that. Ugh. So gross, particularly when he has a history of dating much younger women. I think it's completely gross that he dated Winona Ryder when she was 17. I do remember the time I was there. I'm, I think really close to Winona Ryder's age, actually. I think I'm a couple years younger than Winona Ryder. So I remember the times. Oh God, all of us who are as old as me, do you remember the fucking 80s? I remember the way the 3-letter F word was used, the homophobia, the rape scenes in almost every comedy movie. It's a horrible world. And I'm not saying that to exonerate Johnny Depp as being a part of it, because obviously it was possible to be better and some people were better. I'm just saying, I know why he wasn't brought up on charges. I know why Winona Ryder might have experienced things that today, if it was happening right now, for one thing, that's, she's underage. He could be on a sex offender list for that these days. And also, the way he treated her as this much older man, just having interest in her as so much older is gross. I can see why that wasn't even perceived that way by the participants at the time. And what she has said is that he didn't ever get violent with her. And I believe that to also be true. That doesn't mean his behavior towards her was all great, or that it wasn't misogynistic, or that it wasn't a form of, for all I know, I wasn't there and I can't say emotional abuse. There is accounts from people he's dated that he's, this kind of jealousy. That's kind of a thing he has. That's not healthy. That's not great. None of it is violence though. And what Amber Heard alleged was not just violence, but really, really extreme levels of violence with not just no evidence for it, because sometimes there's an evidence of these things, but wildly contradictory, just faked evidence that was obviously faked, bullshit statements that she contradicted herself in the next moment. It's not just an absence of evidence. It is so much evidence of lying about specifically this, not just that she has low credibility because she lied about the donation. I think that was kind of appalling, but and the way she talks about it still, people work really hard to defend it as, come on, people, get a grip. But that's not actually fundamental to the issues. There was so much evidence of a hoax, of deliberate lying, not just a lack of evidence of abuse. And we don't see that in other cases. So that's why I can believe that Johnny Depp may be violent. He may be emotionally abusive to his partners. I'm not saying he is or he isn't. I can't possibly know. I don't have an opinion on it. I'm just saying, sure, I find that totally plausible. I find it plausible he's a lifelong misogynist. It's obvious that he had endured horrific abuse and started drug use really early. And I would be shocked if he were normal out of that, I just hope he gets help. And frankly, that's very similar to how I feel about Amber Heard, and particularly Johnny Depp when he was the ages Amber Heard has been through this, from the time they met to the present. That was the height of his wild antics that we all saw in the media back in the day, right? So, I mean, if anything, he was maybe just as bad. It may be that he was not, his particular childhood trauma did not result in violent acts. And it sounds like there was a very specific story of the way that the trauma happened, is that his mother was abusive and his dad stood and took it. That makes tons of sense to me, that what he does is stand and take it or run away, but also kind of play his role in the dynamic, because that would be where he came from. Amber Heard was also abused in childhood. She's, you know, if you heard, and I mentioned this in the last video, the most clearly real felt thing she ever said on the stand was this really aggressive, I am not a victim. I have never said I'm a victim. To me, that spoke so clearly of someone who's just fighting so hard to not be a victim. And that, I really feel that, and I think that's absolutely real. And I think that that can come out in aggression towards others that is actually felt like being victimized, but in, you know, objective fact involves hitting other people, and that's unacceptable. I think basically that's kind of what happens. I think they're both really messed up. I think it's, you know, sick, toxic relationship. But it's also very clear that Amber Heard did do the hitting. Johnny Depp did the running away, which, because she has borderline personality disorder, which involves a really indescribably painful experience of abandonment from even the most minor situation. She says in one of the tapes, for example, that she felt like she was having a heart attack. I believe that to be true. From what I understand, I'm not an expert, from what I understand, the expert testimony of Dr. Curry on the stand is that that is exactly what it feels like to someone with borderline personality disorder, which is, by the way, very, very similar to CPTSD, or history of child abuse, particularly in a typical form of abandonment or cycles of abandonment and violence, for example, that is just very, very likely that the narratives make so much sense, sadly, horribly. So anyway, what I'm going back to is these sort of threads of receipts of how misogynist Johnny is. Looking at this from a professional researcher's point of view, on the one hand, threads of receipts have this thing on the internet of that's the real deal. That's something we can believe. And I've seen historians have been a big part of this. One of the most famous historians on Twitter, right, is the Princeton historian, Kevin Cruz. I just blanked on his last name for a second there. I was thinking of the historians Kevin on Twitter. There's several great historians named Kevin on Twitter. Anyway, Kevin Cruz on Twitter is sort of famous for these long threads during the Trump administration with the data, the real historical research that completely you know, debunked stuff that was going around coming out of the administration and right-wing media in general. And that was absolutely real. I mean, he blows me away about having all that research at his fingertips. It is his area of study, and I have, you know, my research at my fingertips, just no one cares. But it was really a ton of stuff that he could get the exact right thing so quickly. Blew me away. It still blows me away. It was great. Those kinds of threads became kind of a thing during the Trump administration. We also saw a lot of Black Twitter, which is another area of Twitter I really love and respect and admire a great deal, coming up with kind of the trope of receipt threads, of here's all the receipts to show how wrong you are, right? And again, having so much at your fingertips, having to do the emotional labor of producing that. And I think, you know, Kevin Cruz at Princeton, that's his role. And he says this himself. He's a very privileged, you know, white male professor at Princeton. So of course he should spend his time doing that. I admire him for doing it, but I also think it's right for him to do that. And he should be doing that, right? And it's great that he does. Black Twitter shouldn't have to do this for everybody all the goddamn time, but they do, and it's there, and it's really valuable. So there's a lot of respect associated with receipt threads and having the receipts. And I, as a researcher, love when people on social media bring not just evidence, not just you know, footnotes, but primary source evidence, often sometimes, you know, actual photographs of primary sources of, you know, literal receipts. Sometimes what they really mean by receipts are, you know, the actual, you know, screenshots or documents or newspaper accounts from the time or whatever that demonstrate something, right? That's using primary source evidence to support your claim. I love it. I love to see it. It's great. As it's become more and more of a thing to have receipt threads, not all receipt threads are alike. And some of them, you know, I'm looking at them and I'm going, okay, that's kind of like a lot of random stuff you find on the internet. It doesn't actually have the warrant. When we talk about the logic of argument, there are some specialized terms. A claim is when you say, this is the thing I think is true. The evidence is what you bring to support it. The reasoning is the because statement, why this evidence supports this claim, right? And when I explain it, that's my reasoning. There's another term that I frankly don't even use in the classroom. I don't use it in my book. It's too technical to be sort of worth it, but it is the word we need here because it's what's often missing in some of the not so useful receipt threads. It's the warrant. The warrant is, let me actually pause and give you a quote. Well, Derp, the book I wanted is actually in my campus office, so I can't quote it. So I'm gonna have to explain it in my own words. So in technical terms, the pieces of an argument are actually the claim, the evidence that supports it, and the warrant, which is the sort of objective, logical, rational basis on which this evidence does in fact support that claim. It's not just a random thing that exists in the same space as the claim, right? But it actually supports the claim. So I tend to not use that word. I talk about reasoning instead, but reasoning is much more general. Reasoning can be, this is my explanation of how this should be connected. And you can actually use reasoning rhetorically. You can use reasoning quite creatively. You can employ a lot of rhetorical tactics to sort of convince people of things, which we see a lot of people do consciously and unconsciously all the time. A warrant is much more technical, but it's what I really want to pinpoint here. A warrant is the thing that exists in the real world objectively outside of any rhetoric I may produce, outside of any of my sort of personal reasoning, which of course comes out of my head and my way of seeing the world. A warrant is the actual objectively logical connection between the evidence and the claim, that it exists no matter how we choose to talk about it or whether we choose to admit it's there or not, it exists, right? Or it doesn't exist. And what I see in some of these receipts threads is no warrant. There's no warrants there at all. And sometimes there's an attempt to explain, sometimes it's just a thread of evidence or receipts that are meant to speak for themselves. Either way, sometimes the logical warrant is not there. For example, a lot of these threads do show that Johnny Depp may be very misogynistic and maybe throughout his life. They do not, however, remotely address the issue of whether Amber Heard abused him. It's just not even relevant. It's not relevant at all, but it's meant obviously to support that claim. People can be jerks and still be victims. People can be liars and still be telling the truth sometimes. And that's a fair way to approach Amber Heard and say, she may have a history of lying, she may not be credible, but that doesn't mean she wasn't abused. I absolutely agree with you, except that I heard the tapes and I heard her abusing him and I heard him running away. And I heard not one iota of evidence ever that he ever touched her. And there were plenty of witnesses that were not paid, objective witnesses, outside witnesses. I mean, honestly, listen to the freaking trial. I'm not going to go through all of it, but it's all there. And no, you have not been told about all of it if you've read whole articles. And a lot of this stuff on social media, people are frankly not reading whole articles. They're just looking at headlines. I also saw someone on Twitter who I really respect or respected, I'm not sure if I have to put it in the past tense, going super deep on one claim and then drawing a conclusion from it as if that then answers the whole thing. No, sorry. One claim that, say, Amber Heard makes may be true. And I do think there's some things she said that are true. I think if she had, and I'm pretty sure this is at least what one of her lawyers, Rottenborn, wanted to do based on his opening statement, if she had made very limited claims that the headline of the op-ed did not refer to Johnny Depp, and that to the extent that op-ed did refer to Johnny Depp, he committed emotional abuse, financial abuse, those kinds of abuse, I think she would have won and won easily. And I think it would have been a justified verdict if she had won on those counts from the evidence that I saw. She made huge claims, not just of several specific incidents of sexual violence, but also really, really, really extensive physical violence. And then didn't just not have evidence, she had faked evidence and absence of evidence and contradictory claims. And as she told those claims on the stand, and that is part of the evidence, she was just really obviously faking. And I know that sounds totally subjective. The thing is, when everybody watching it concludes the same thing, that's a sign. And again, majority may be wrong, and we're all coming from a misogynistic society of seeing that. But this is also a case where the judge, the two main lawyers were all women. Many of the main expert witnesses were women, and there was no misogyny towards them. And in fact, Elaine Bredehoff, who was one of the attorneys, who was, I don't know, from my perspective, she seemed wildly incompetent, but nonetheless, the commentary and most of what I was seeing on social media of the people watching the trial was really feeling sorry for her for being stuck between a rock and a hard place, that basically she had a difficult client, difficult factual situation, and she was doing the best she could within that. And oh my God, really disappointing expert witnesses, which, you know, it's her responsibility to choose those expert witnesses, but she can't entirely predict what they're going to be. And I wouldn't want to be the lawyer dealing with that and trying to clean it up. There was a lot of empathy for her, the opposite of a purely misogynistic approach, until she really doubled down and just took zero responsibility whatsoever and perpetuated a bunch of things we have been proven in court to be lies, that are obviously proven to be lies by all of the receipts, and these are directly warranted receipts, in the media swirl afterwards. And then of course it was just particularly egregious that she literally accused every single one of the witnesses for Johnny Depp for only being on the stand to get their 15 minutes of fame. And she's literally the first one on the circuit the second the trial ends. And yeah, I don't think that's significant in any way, but oh, bad luck, bad luck. Anyway, so going back to sort of receipts, one claim can be true. It doesn't mean that all of the claims are true. You can go into one specific set of circumstances really deeply and come to a conclusion. It doesn't tell you anything about the larger scenario. And also, actually, when I saw that being done in that particular case, it was also just wrong. Even someone who thought, and this is someone I really respected, who does research for a living, and no, I'm not going to name them, but went really deep into one claim. By really deep, they cherry picked all the evidence. It was just completely cherry picked. I know what evidence is out there, and they chose. What happens sometimes is when you're going in with a view, and this is why it's, you know, best to go in with nothing more than a hypothesis at best. And a lot of what research training is for, the reason training is worth it, the reason you can't get it from just reading books or just, you know, trying to be careful. Why you really need rigorous formal training is because you need other people to hold your feet to the fire. That's the only way any of us can do it. It's not like some people are better at this than others and can be trusted or can trust themselves because you're a good person. You can be a morally fantastic person. You can be an incredibly honest person. You can still do research in an incredibly biased way, because the point of bias is you don't see it. That's the definition of bias. You don't see what you're doing. That's why you have to have other people calling you on it. And other people calling you on it can, of course, just become social media nastiness unless it's done in a formal setting in which all of the ways this happens is formalized and questioned and re-questioned and re-questioned, so that if the, you know, accusations of bias you're getting, and they shouldn't be formed as accusations, it should be careful vetting of evidence and claims, right? That's how we're actually supposed to do it. I'm talking about academia and theory. A lot of it does actually devolve into social media like pettiness, but it's in theory how it works, and the training does, on the whole, mostly get people there. Nobody's perfect, right? And it doesn't always happen perfectly, but these are the principles, and these are the principles you get trained in with formal training and research, is that there are systematic questions. You have to ask all of the questions. There are systematic criteria on which evidence can be accepted or not accepted. You have to systematically look for the warrant, make sure it's there, and all of this has to be questioned by others, and then you question back and question again and question again. This is why academia is so slow, but more reliable, at least in theory, right? So I've seen some really egregious examples of things that have all of the sound of being very rational, evidence-based arguments with no there. There's no content. And anybody who does real research is looking at that going, no. What I'm seeing in those cases is someone who has started with a position, works really, really, really hard to find all the support for that position, and works really, really, really hard not to see anything on the other side. And that's just bad. I'm sorry, it's just bias. It's just bad. It's bad thinking. It's certainly not critical thinking. It's the opposite of critical thinking. Critical thinking is forcing yourself to make the case for the other side if you come in with a particular point of view. To work really hard at that, actually. I teach this every day. I do it in my own work. I was trained to do this over many years. That is how you do it. Of course, even better is if you come in with an open mind. But sometimes we're coming in with a hypothesis. Oftentimes, I mean, to even begin to know where to find sources, you have to come up with something like a hypothesis. But generally speaking, you want that to be as open-ended as possible. You absolutely have to, and this is why, for example, a PhD student has to defend a prospectus. Part of that is core to that process is showing to a committee that you have asked the questions of what are the other possibilities here, having them try to poke holes in that. And they often will raise things you haven't thought of because nobody thinks of everything. And that's part of the process. And it should be welcomed as part of the process of getting closer to truth, because that's ultimately what we want. And you want The idea is to be motivated to find the best answer more than to find your answer. Now, of course, all humans have biases, so we have to actively have structures to address that. Social media is the exact opposite of that structure. Social media is a bias machine. It is a reinforcement of bias machine. That's kind of all it does. Okay, one last point, and then I'm going to leave, about analogies. I'm going to have a whole other video about analogies in history because it's really interesting to me that one of the, I think the main thing most people, most non-historians think is the value of history are historical analogies of, what's happening now is like, find the closest historical example, maybe find a couple of historical examples if you're really good, learn from that, right? Why else would we study the past if it wasn't useful to the present? That's a really common belief. Some of us historians will say, no, actually, that's the opposite. And historical analogies, you will never catch a historian making one in any seriousness. In an op-ed, sure, on social media, sure, but never in a published work of research. And a lot of historians will very grumpily argue against analogies in general. And what then I often see non-historians react to with that is, oh, so it's not useful at all. Why the hell would we do this? Dismiss it, crap, garbage. If it's not useful to us, why are we doing it, right? You can nerd out on your boring stuff, but it's like studying, fantasy baseball or something. If you're enjoying it, have fun, knock yourself out, but why should the rest of us care, right? All of that's so wrong. All of that is just complete misunderstanding. So historical analogies are, let's start here, the opposite of what historians do, in the sense that history is what we call a splitting field rather than a lumping field. I don't remember who came up with this. It's just kind of one of those tropes that goes around academic circles. I believe somebody came up with it initially, though, but that you can divide different scholars into lumpers and splitters. Some researchers are lumpers, meaning what they're doing is lumping different things together to find patterns and models for how things work, and sort of talking on a meta level about how things work in general, right? Splitters are people who are always distinguishing this one from another one to get more accurate on the actual cases we're looking at. History in general tends to be more of the splitting kind, is almost definitionally a splitting kind, because the difference, for example, between a historian studying war and a political scientist studying war is political scientists are trying to study the patterns of war, what causes war, for example, one of the big questions, obviously, of political science for obvious reasons. You're trying to look at multiple wars to find a pattern, a set of common causes that we could then learn from, right? Historian is only ever going to study individual wars. Now, that doesn't mean you can't compare wars, but you're going to distinguish the causes of one war from the causes of another war as minutely as possible. And you might specifically compare similar ones in order to distinguish them rather than to lump them together. Notice that the historian's work is going to make the political scientist's work better, because they're going to read our books about particular wars in order to find their patterns in wars, right? So the better we're distinguishing wars, the better information they have to build on. And in many ways, the value of history is actually foundational to, say, popular historians who read academic historians' work and then create a more synthetic overview that tells a narrative to the general public that is evidence-based. When it's done well, that's what it should be. Well, guess what? That can't exist without the academic historians spending their lifetimes in the archives, doing the really, really slow work of really vetting that evidence so that the popular historians have something decent to rely on. And when academic historians complain about popular historians, a lot of the time it's because they're reading bad books instead of the good books that are out there that a lot of work went into. And they're just perpetuating sort of old narratives that we know to be untrue. Of course, we get upset about that. That's not petty. Sometimes there's petty jealousy involved, but that's not petty. That's actually really fundamental. And frankly, as an ordinary citizen who reads history, if that's who you are, you should care. You should pay attention. You should take that seriously. Anyway, so if historians are mostly splitters, that means that we don't like analogies because analogies are lumping, right? An analogy is saying this thing is like this other thing. Well, a historian's kind of impulse tends to be, oh, here's all the ways that they're different. So we get this kind of thing. Historians hate analogies. Everybody else wants a historical analogy. Analogies are not completely useless on the face. An analogy is a heuristic. It's a kind of tool or a model or game or mind game. It's a mind game to try something out, much like what if history, which is, like, what if Paul Revere's horse broke a leg and he didn't get his message through? Then what would have happened? Where would we be today if there was no American Revolution? Blah, 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 right? There's great fiction written on that basis. It's a lot of fun to think about. It's not, obviously not academic history. We deal in evidence. It's an evidence-based field, so we don't make things up. We don't explore imaginary scenarios. We do actually sometimes in the classroom, and we might have a lot of fun with that on social media, right? What I'm saying is that what historians will publish needs to be reliable for other researchers to use and to be used by other disciplines and by the public. So that has to be no lazy analogies. It has to be purely evidence-based. That's why there's all those footnotes. That's why we can't drop characters that are just, fuzzying up the narrative, muddying the waters, as a popular historian can do. Well, we have to be accurate. I'm sorry, we have to be accurate. Accuracy matters. It's good, which is why there's also a place for someone else to kind of write a great story out of something that is evidence-based and take something that's real, but is a little bit more artful out of it. There's a place for that. It's great if they're really using the real stuff and not, completely misconstruing it. But they have to have the real stuff to use in the first place. Somebody has to go and into the archives, and it is endless and boring and slow, and get those real facts and document those facts accurately. So that in terms of historical research, yes, we don't do analogies. But of course, historians are also humans. And yes, we like to think about analogies. But from a historian's point of view, the value of analogy is not to say, because this happened here, this will happen there. No, never. History does not repeat itself. That's never what's going to happen. The way you use an analogy helpfully as a useful mind game is to say, let's try, just for the sake of the experiment, to compare these two things. What are the ways in there that they're similar that might tell us something about where we are now? That's where most people get. That's only step one. Step two, at least as important, is to say, in what ways are they different? What does that have to tell us about what's going on right now? How can we learn from that? And then go back to the fact that none of that actually is true, right? It was a game. It was something to think through and to learn from as an exercise in critical thinking. And it's not an exercise in critical thinking if you only go halfway there. It is an exercise in bias if you only go halfway there. Most of the use of historical analogies in the public setting is to just reinforce your biases, to just cherry pick historical examples to reinforce your side. The other side can do the same thing. It's all a waste of time. There are some really good history podcasts by academic historians that will deliberately address these historical analogies. They're mostly by Americanists in an American history setting. I listen to them, particularly during the Trump administration. I found it comforting, where they will take this kind of public interest in an analogy and do the thing of actually drawing it out into all the similarities and differences. And so I encourage you to try to listen to some of those and get the feeling for what that can be when it's done right. And when you get the occasional, op-ed by, say, a famous historian of fascism who's like, is Trump Hitler? And obviously, the historian's going to say, of course he's not Hitler. Fascism was specific to the 1930s. It's definitional about a thing that happened in Europe in the 1930s. So of course, nothing today is fascism. But you can play through what are the similarities? It's deeply disturbing, and we should absolutely pay attention and be concerned that there are similarities. There are differences. We live in a different world with different concerns. We're different people. We should pay attention to the similarities, think about the options and maybe lessons learned when something similar happened before, but also pay attention to the differences. And that's what a good historian will always do. Okay, so let me apply this with the whole Depp Heard thing. One of the things I've seen a lot in social media, and I appreciate it, it's coming from my team, so to speak, and other people who tend to think like me, but I ultimately find it disturbing and wrong, is the idea that what's happening to Amber Heard in this trial is just like what happened to Monica Lewinsky, to Anita Hill, to the frankly litany of women who have been sexually harassed or abused by powerful men. And when that hits a big national media splash, the coverage is extremely misogynistic. It always depicts the women as slutty, as infantile, as liars, as, I just didn't want to go into all the horrible shit. It's gross. All of those examples are real examples of totally misogynistic culture. I hope many of us looking back at those things today look back and go, oh my God, we're such a misogynistic culture. I know that Monica Lewinsky happened when I was quite young, Anita Hill even younger. And my memory of experiences those things is just, as a young woman myself, being like, they're being so demonized. And I wasn't mature enough to just completely see through that demonization, but I was also able enough to identify with other young women to go, but really? why? There must be something all these grownups know that I don't, because I'm not following, is what I remember as my feeling about it. And when I look back at it today, I hope where we live today, for people who are also young women watching this, there's enough out there that says, whoa, look at this. This is misogyny. This is what's really going on here. That's great. I'm so glad it exists now. And by the way, if you're a young woman today and you have not yet read Kate Manne, the philosopher, on misogyny in its various forms, absolutely please read it. It's not a totally easy read, and not just because it's kind of disturbing material. It's challenging, but so worth your time. It's some really deep thinking about the nature of misogyny. And of course, not just for young women, for everybody, and particularly if you happen to be a white male, particularly one with power. Oh, it's past time for you to read Kate Manne. Anyway, all of that said, the analogy being made is, here's another young woman in public in the center of a big swirling scandal, and she's being treated really misogynistically. And of course, that analogy holds in the sense that everything I just said is true. On the other hand, is Amber Heard analogous to Anita Hill or Monica Lewinsky? No. Anita Hill and Monica Lewinsky were not lying. They were not creating huge false accusations against anyone. They were telling the truth. There was evidence for what they were saying. They were both in positions where a man in power abused them. Now, Johnny Depp does have a lot more power than Amber Heard, so it is plausible to believe that she could have been in a situation similar, and that therefore her allegations are true. And I totally see, if you haven't seen any of the evidence yet, you've only seen the media accounts, which are false, that leave out all the important stuff and literally lie. I mean, I've seen mainstream legacy media that's supposed to have fact checkers just say things outright wrong. And I can't tell you what it means for me to be shocked by this, because I'm not shocked by much in terms of media, but whoa, it's really that bad. Why do we choose this analogy? Obviously, there's some reasons for it, and there's some obvious reasons to believe it, but it's not the only possible analogy. And when we notice the similarities, it does not mean there aren't differences. The differences are in the evidence of what these women actually did or did not do in the case of Anita Hill and Monica Lewinsky. Why have the people coming from the general political and ideological perspective that I come, not gone to, for example, Heather Mills, who was married to Paul McCartney, and I actually don't know her name, but the woman who killed Phil Hartman, his wife, who killed him? I believe those to be closer analogies to Amber Heard. Both women were clearly very disturbed. Both women abused their husbands. In one case, Paul McCartney was able to divorce Heather Mills, and it's all kind of gone by the wayside. Tragically, just so I love Phil Hartman, but it's so tragically his wife did kill him, and I think she was severely mentally ill, and she deserves all our sympathy. Now look at the way these were both big media splashes as well. Was the coverage of Heather Mills or Phil Hartman's wife, who, I mean, part of the misogyny is that she remains nameless. Obviously the names were printed, but nobody remembers, right? I certainly don't remember. I don't know anyone else who remembers. She's always referred to as Phil Hartman's wife. There's a little bit misogynistic in there, but it's kind of obvious why that is the case. Phil Hartman was a public figure and his wife was not. I don't remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't remember any notable misogyny other than perhaps from the kinds of sources that literally every word out of their mouths is misogynistic, not including that. We know who they are. 10% of everybody's crazy on something, right? But if we're talking about the mainstream legacy media, the night talk show hosts, the mainstream culture, social media wasn't entirely there, and that may be a big factor in this. I think it's one we should consider, but to the extent that there's a kind of public discussion, public reactions, and so on for Heather Mills or the Phil Hartman thing, I don't remember it being misogynistic. If anything, I remember it being, there being some, certainly when Paul McCartney thing happened, I initially believed Heather Mills because he's a man in power, and the Beatles frankly have had, strange lives, and that kind of celebrity and that kind of wealth and that kind of influence and that kind of just bizarre experiences can really warp a person's perceptions. And I thought Heather Mills is apparently some kind of ordinary person, and maybe this is just really messed up, or sort of on both sides, or maybe she's, just caught up in something awful. As it came out through the court case, it became fairly clear, unfortunately, that she was really trying to take advantage of Paul McCartney. And of course, people with a lot of money I think we all need to admit, obviously, it can happen that people do make false accusations to get money from rich people. We know that is a thing. It does not remotely justify disbelieving women in general or any particular women. But when the evidence comes out and is pretty clear, obviously we must accept that this does occasionally happen. You are hopelessly biased if you refuse to accept that at all. And those are two cases I can think of where a case was a powerful and famous man was harmed by a woman. And I think it's very analogous actually to Amber Heard because partly some of the really specific things both of those women were doing, and I didn't remember any details, but I did, just a quick Wikipedia look up, not any kind of research or anything, but just to kind of remind myself of some of the details. And yeah, I think there's quite a lot that's analogous there, which is not to say that it's all similar. Of course, it's not all the same. None of these three women had the exact same motives or circumstances. None of the three men involved are the same. And in fact, I mean, Johnny Depp's own behavior, I think there's enough evidence of some deeply toxic stuff that I didn't actually see in Paul McCartney or Phil Hartman. So I think there's a little bit more wiggle room. And like I said, if the trial had just been about emotional abuse, I think the jury would have concluded it was mutual and neither would have won, or Amber Heard might have won. And that would have been very plausible and perfectly just outcome in my mind from what I saw. So why aren't we making that analogy? Why does everybody immediately leap to the one set of analogies, see it only from all of the similarities, do not even try to ask what the differences are, ignore the other possible analogies? It's bad thinking. It's social media thinking. And what critical thinking teaches you to do is to make yourself ask not just for similarities, but also for differences. Then ask, are there other analogies, better analogies, just different analogies? Just brainstorm as many analogies as possible. Okay, let's look at the similarities and the differences for each one. What have we learned from all of this? That's the kind of thing you do in a classroom. That is the kind of thing education teaches you. That's what critical thinking is. And it's sorely lacking in our social media discourse. Okay, so that's all I have to say on that. I think that was enough, right? Thank you so much. Obviously, everything I'm saying here is just me talking. I'm not representative of anyone or anything. I'm sure I've pissed people off, but please just go take a walk and think about your feelings because I'm just some person on the internet, not forcing you to believe anything I say, and you are not being forced to listen. Thanks very much.